Well, investors and traders both follow trends, but what happens when you have different trends happening simultaneously in market cycles? Our guest is here to talk about that, Martin Pring. Martin, thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Tim.
Well, you have an interesting chart here today that showed that how trends can happen simultaneously. Let's talk about that.
Well, price at any one particular point in time is determined by the interaction of a lot of different time cycles. And that's what this diagram here is showing you in a partial way. First of all, I'm going to show you this thick green line, which represents the primary trend. The primary trend is the one that revolves around a business cycle. And it lasts approximately 9 months to 2 years on the upside and 9 months to 2 years on the downside for an average of, say, 3 or 4 between the troughs. It's the dominant trend in the stock market. But markets, as you know, don't go straight up and straight down. And I've just put in this blue line, which is the intermediate trend. And the intermediate trend lasts from 6 weeks to 9 months. And typically the intermediate trend will be driven by some psychological factor. For example, if we take this point just here, for example, when the bull market's been going for a year or so, quite often what will happen is the economy tightens up, the Fed raises rates, and people say, oh my gosh, the Fed's raising rates, we better sell stocks. So that's the motivating psychological force for this particular intermediate decline. And then people realize, well, they're raising the rates because the economy is strong and profits are going to go up. So then they get back into the stock market and then push the stock market higher. So there's all these kinds of psychological reasons why we go and undergo these intermediate corrections. And then the more random trend that we have is what we call the short-term trend, which lasts from 2 to 6 weeks.
What am I to do as an investor then, knowing this about the market?
Well, it depends on whether you're an investor or a trader. But in both situations, you want to have some understanding of the direction of the main trend. For example, if you're an investor, you want to be accumulating when that green line is coming down and starting to turn up. And you want to be selling when the green line is turning down from having been up. But even as a short-term trader, where you're not going to be holding for long periods of time, it's important to know the direction of the main trend, because a rising tide lifts all boats. And if you look at the short-term trend in these charts here, you'll see that the magnitude is always going in the direction of the primary trend. So in other words, when the primary trend is up, the magnitude goes with the short-term trend on the upside, and when the primary trend is down, the magnitude goes on the downside. And if you're going to get a whipsaw breakout, from a price pattern, it's inevitably going to happen when you get a breakout which goes against the direction of the main trend.
So whichever trend that you kind of focus on, you've got to shorten your time frame or lengthen it based on which one you're looking at.
You want to make sure you understand or make some effort to try and understand the direction and the maturity of the primary trend, because the primary trend dominates the characteristics of the short-term trend.
Could you go even further down to, say, an hourly chart or a 15-minute chart on something like this as well?
Yeah, you could. This chart here, for example, shows you the short-term trend that we had on the previous chart. Now, for intraday traders, we change that short-term trend, and that now becomes our primary trend for short-term trading. And you can divide that down into the intermediate trend, which would last, we'll say, for 4 to 12 days. And you can have a short-term trend, which would last, we'll say, from 4 to 12 hours. So the same principle is holding true, that you're looking at the primary trend or the more dominant trend, the 2 to 6 week trend in this case as a trader, and saying that's the dominant trend and I just want to trade in that direction of that dominant trend.
Martin, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tim.
You're watching the MoneyShow.com video network.